The coffee was cold. That was the first thing Edmund noticed, not the empty hooks where her coat and hat should have been, not the stillness in the house that was a different quality of stillness than sleep, not the absence of sound from the kitchen where, for 11 years, there had always been some sound by 7 in the morning. The first thing was the coffee, set on the edge of the stove as if placed there with intention, as if she had made it and then thought, "No, let him find it this way. Let the cold be the first word of it." He stood in the kitchen in his undershirt and held the cup and understood. Edmund Farrow was 43 years old and not a stupid man. He had a medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania and a particular gift for diagnosis, for reading the body's small confessions. The yellowed whites of eyes, the way a man held his shoulder when he thought no one was looking, the precise location of pain when a woman pressed 2 fingers just below her ribs and said, "It's nothing really, I don't know why I came." He was good at seeing what people tried to hide. He had, in 11 years of marriage, entirely failed to see his wife. He set the cup down. On the kitchen table, there was a letter, 2 pages in Constance's careful handwriting, and beside it her house key, placed with the same deliberate precision as the coffee. He read the letter standing up, still in his undershirt, the September morning pressing cold against the window glass. He read it twice. Then he folded it along its original creases and set it back on the table, and stood there for a moment with his hands flat on the wood. The letter was not angry. That was the thing about it, the thing that would stay with him, that would come back to him at odd moments for weeks afterward, while he was washing his hands between patients, or lying awake at 2 in the morning with the house making its nighttime sounds around him. The letter was not angry. It was careful, and it was sad, and it was written by a woman who had been composing it in her head, Edmund suspected, for considerably longer than one Tuesday morning. "I have been trying to explain this to you for 3 years, she had written, "and I have not been able to make you hear it. I don't believe that is entirely your fault. I believe you hear what you know how to hear, and what I have been saying is not something you have a language for." He went upstairs and looked in the wardrobe. Half empty, she had taken her good dresses, her winter coat, the small wooden box where she kept her mother's earrings, and the cameo brooch she never wore but would not part with. She had not taken the silver candlesticks, which had been a wedding gift from his mother, and which Constance had always polished herself, without being asked, every 3rd Sunday, while Edmund read the paper in the next room. He noticed the candlesticks. He noticed them in the particular way a man notices something when it is too late for the noticing to be of any use. The practice occupied the ground floor of the house, 3 rooms converted 11 years ago when they had moved to Harlan, a town of 4,000 in the eastern Colorado flatlands that had needed a doctor badly enough to help a young married couple with the cost of the conversion. Edmund's office was at the front, with its examination table and glass-fronted cabinet of instruments. The waiting room had been the parlor once, and still had the parlor's high ceiling and good light, though Constance had replaced the parlor furniture with 6 straight-backed chairs and a small table where she kept a stack of old magazines and a glass of dried flowers that she changed every 2 weeks. The 3rd room was the records room, which was also, in practice, Constance's room. The room where she kept the appointment ledger, the patient files, the accounts, the supply inventory, the correspondence with the pharmacy in Denver, the letters to and from the 2 other physicians in the county with whom Edmund maintained collegial relationships. Edmund had not been in the records room in 4 months, except to retrieve a specific file when Constance was occupied elsewhere. He stood in the doorway of it on Tuesday morning and looked at the desk and the filing cabinet and the ledger open on the blotter, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes too late, that he did not know precisely how any of it worked. He knew the broad architecture. Patients came, Constance scheduled them. They were seen. Constance recorded the visit and sent the bill if billing was warranted. Payment came or did not come. Supplies ran low and were ordered. Instruments were cleaned and catalogued. The county health office sent forms quarterly that required completion and return. He knew these things happened. He had not known, until this moment, that he had organized his understanding of his own practice around the assumption that they would continue to happen without requiring his attention, the way a man assumes the sun will rise, not because he has arranged it, but because it has always been arranged. He went to the ledger and opened it and looked at Constance's handwriting, the neat columns of names and dates and amounts, the small notations in the margin. Payment pending, spoke to Mr. H. Reinstallment, called pharmacy, reordered iodine and sulfur powder, and felt something that was not quite grief, and not quite shame, but lived in the neighborhood of both. On the desk, held down by the glass paperweight that had been a gift from a patient, was a single sheet of paper. A list, written in Constance's hand, of the week's scheduled appointments. 14 names, Tuesday through Friday. She had left him the list. He stood there and looked at it for a long time. He saw Tuesday's patients himself, which is to say he examined them and treated them and said what needed to be said, because that part he could do. Mrs. Aldrich's youngest had a fever that had broken in the night and needed only reassurance and rest. Old Pete Garrow came in about his back, which was a conversation Edmund had been having with Pete Garrow for 6 years, and which would not change materially until Pete Garrow stopped sleeping on a mattress that had been losing its stuffing since the Hayes administration. Young Tom Fielding, 19, a ranch hand with a gash across his forearm from a piece of wire fencing, sat in the chair and went pale while Edmund cleaned and sutured the wound, and asked about the Fielding family's new property out past the creek, which was the kind of thing Constance had always known to ask, and which Edmund asked now because he was trying. What he could not do was find the Aldrich file when he went to record Mrs. Aldrich's visit. He found it eventually, after 8 minutes of searching, because Constance filed by the patient's first name rather than their surname, a system that made sense to her and that she had, he now recalled, explained to him once, and which he had absorbed without retaining. He found it and made his notation, and then sat for a moment with the file in his hand, thinking about the fact that there were, by his rough count, approximately 400 such files in the cabinet, organized by a logic he would have to reverse engineer from the files themselves. He ate dinner alone that night. He had found bread and some cold chicken in the icebox, and he ate at the kitchen table with the letter in front of him, not reading it again, just letting it be present. Outside, the September dark came down over Harlan in its usual way, the way it always had, indifferent to the specific sorrows of the people under it. He thought about Constance at 14. He did not know precisely what Constance had been doing at 14. Her family was from Ohio. Her father had been a school teacher. She had told him stories over the years that he had half listened to in the comfortable way of a man who assumes there will always be more time to listen. He thought about her at 14 anyway, tried to construct it, and found he could not. He did not know her well enough. That was the sentence that came to him in the kitchen with the cold chicken and the dark outside and the letter on the table. I do not know my wife well enough to imagine her at 14. And the past tense of wife struck him like something physical, a pressure behind the sternum that he recognized clinically as grief and felt as something rawer than any clinical term. He was not a man who cried easily. He did not cry now. He sat at the table until the lamp burned low, and then he went to bed in a room that was half empty in a way he had not noticed before tonight, because presence, he was learning, is only visible in the moment it becomes absence. Wednesday would be its own education. But before Wednesday, before the waiting room filled with its 14 names and its unscheduled additions, and its questions he did not know how to answer, Edmund lay in the dark of the bedroom and looked at the ceiling and thought about the records room. He thought about the appointment ledger, about the supply inventory, about the correspondence he did not know the current state of, about the quarterly forms for the county health office due the 1st of October, which was 11 days away. He thought about the note Constance had left, the one under the paperweight, the list of this week's patients. She had written it out for him. She had, in the act of leaving, thought to do that, thought to make sure the week's patients had their appointments recorded somewhere he could find them, thought to smooth the first days of her absence, even as she was arranging the absence itself. He could not decide if that was kindness or if it was something else, something more complicated than kindness. The reflex of a woman so practiced in the management of other people's difficulties that she did it automatically, without thinking, even when the difficulty she was managing was her own departure. He fell asleep finally around 2 in the morning and dreamed nothing he could remember. In the morning there would be 11 patients and no one to manage them, and the day after that there would be more because word traveled in a town of 4,000, and what was traveling was not yet the story of why Constance Farrow had gone, but only the simpler fact of the going. And people who needed a doctor did not stop needing a doctor because his life had come temporarily apart. He would manage. He was a competent man. He had managed many things. He had not managed the right ones. Thursday morning, 2 days from now, the door to the waiting room would open at 7:45, before Edmund had come downstairs, before he had made the coffee, before he had looked at the ledger and remembered again that he did not understand the filing system. The door would open and a woman would come in out of the September cold. A woman he had never seen before, lean and straight-backed, with calloused hands and a face that had learned not to ask for things. And she would look at the waiting room, at the 6 chairs and the old magazines, and the glass of dried flowers that needed changing, with the look of a person who has just assessed a situation and already knows what it requires. He did not know this yet. He was asleep. But Tuesday had taken what it had taken, and Wednesday was already waiting just outside the dark, patient as only mornings can be, carrying its own weight of consequence. And somewhere east of Harlan, on the night train toward Denver, Constance Farrow sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the Colorado dark go past the window, and did not cry either, because she had been crying for 3 years in small increments, in the records room with the door closed, in the kitchen after Edmund had gone to bed, and she had used up what she had. She had left the coffee. She had left the list. She had left the candlesticks, which she had polished herself every 3rd Sunday, while he read the paper in the next room. She left a great deal when you counted it properly. She had been leaving it for years. The coffee was cold again on Wednesday morning, but this time it was his own fault. Edmund had made it at 6 and forgotten it, standing in the doorway of the records room with the list Constance had left, reading it for the 4th time as though it might yield something new. It did not. It was the same list it had been at midnight, at 2 in the morning, at 4:30 when he had given up on sleep and come downstairs in his socks, to stand in the dark kitchen and understand, with the particular clarity that only sleeplessness provides, that he did not know how to run his own practice. The list was written in Constance's hand, small, precise, the letters slightly compressed as though she had always been conserving space. It read, Appointments. Ledger, top left drawer, locked. Key is on the hook behind the door you have never looked at. Billing. Monthly. The Whitmore account is 30 days past. Supplies. Morphine sulfate low. Order placed but not arrived. Hendricks & Son in Billings. Mrs. Paulson is due Thursday for her dressings. Do not forget she cannot afford the good gauze, and you have been using it anyway. The Henderson children's files are misfiled under H. Adults, not H. Children, which is where you put them in November. That was it. No salutation, no signature, just the list, which was either a final act of cruelty or a final act of care, and Edmund could not decide which, and suspected it was both, and suspected further that Constance had known he would not be able to decide. He drank the cold coffee standing up, because sitting down felt like a concession to something. The first patient arrived at 8:15. Edmund knew this because he heard the door, and then silence, and then the specific quality of silence that a waiting room produces when a person is sitting in it alone, uncertain whether they are supposed to announce themselves. He was in the examination room, having found the appointment ledger. The key had indeed been on the hook behind the door, a small brass hook he had installed himself 11 years ago and had not once used. And he was attempting to decipher Constance's scheduling system, which appeared to operate on a logic that was internally consistent and entirely opaque to him. He came out. The man in the waiting room was Garrett Sully, 43, who ran the feed store on Clement Street and had a face like a week of bad weather. He was holding his right wrist against his chest with the careful stillness of a man who had learned that stillness was the only thing between him and considerable pain. "Garrett," Edmund said. "Doc." Garrett's eyes moved around the waiting room with a neutrality that was not quite neutral. "Mrs. Farrow not in today?" "She's—" Edmund stopped. He had not, it occurred to him, prepared an answer to this question. He had spent Tuesday evening in the records room and Tuesday night not sleeping, and Wednesday morning with the cold coffee and the list, and at no point had he prepared an answer to this question, which was going to be asked by every patient who walked through the door today, and every day following. Because Constance had been the first face people saw when they came to him sick and frightened, and she had been the one who remembered that Garrett Sully's wife had died of a fever in 1891, and that he was therefore alone, and that alone men sometimes did not come in when they should. "She's away," Edmund said. Garrett looked at him for a moment. "Away," he repeated, in the tone of a man who has heard a medical diagnosis he doesn't believe. "Let me see the wrist," Edmund said. It was a fracture of the distal radius, a clean one, the kind that came from a fall with the arm extended, the body's instinct to catch itself, overriding the body's structural capacity to do so. Edmund had set dozens of them. His hands knew the procedure the way his mind knew the alphabet, automatically, in sequence, without requiring thought. "How did you come down?" he asked, positioning the wrist. "Ice on the step behind the store. Didn't see it." Garrett's jaw was tight. "My own fault." "Ice doesn't ask permission," Edmund said. He had said this, or something like it, to patients for 20 years. It was the kind of thing that was true, and also kind, and also required nothing of him, which was why he had said it so many times. He was only now, with Constance's list in his coat pocket, beginning to understand what it cost a person to find the things that were true and kind, and also didn't require the listener to do anything. To find them and say them, day after day, to people who were frightened or in pain, or both. He splinted the wrist, he wrapped it. He told Garrett to come back in a week. "What do I owe?" Garrett asked. Edmund looked at him. Then he looked at the doorway to the records room, where the billing ledger was, and where he had absolutely no idea how Constance had calculated what any given patient owed him, or what she had written off when she had decided, on whatever basis she used, that a patient could not pay. "Come back in a week," Edmund said. "We'll sort it then." Garrett put on his hat with his good hand. He paused at the door. "She comin' back?" he asked, not looking at Edmund, looking at the door. "I don't know," Edmund said, which was the first entirely honest thing he had said since Tuesday. Garrett nodded once, the way men in Harlan Creek nodded at things they understood too well to comment on, and went out. By 10 o'clock there were 4 people in the waiting room. By 11 there were 6. Edmund knew this because he had to walk through the waiting room to get to the supply cabinet, and he counted them as he passed, and felt something he did not have a precise word for. Not guilt exactly, not embarrassment exactly. Something in the vicinity of both. The feeling of being seen to be inadequate, in a way you had not known you were inadequate until this exact moment. He treated them in order, more or less, guessing at the order from the ledger, which Constance had organized by time of appointment in a hand he could read, but a system he could not fully follow. There were annotations he didn't understand, small symbols in the margins, a check mark that seemed to mean something different than a cross, numbers in parentheses that might have been prior billing or might have been something else entirely. He treated a child's ear infection, the Henderson boy, 7 years old, who cried not from the examination, but from being in the room at all, and whose mother looked at the empty chair behind the front desk with an expression Edmund couldn't interpret. He treated a woman's persistent cough, which was not tuberculosis, which was what she feared, and which was instead the dry air and the coal dust from the stove she had been burning too hot all winter. He told her this. She did not look entirely relieved, because she had come in afraid of one thing, and leaving with another thing required a kind of recalibration that took longer than a single appointment. He treated a miner from the North Camp who had a gash along his forearm from a length of wire and who smelled of cold and iron and 3 days without washing. Edmund cleaned and sutured the wound without comment on any of these things, because the man had come in, which was what mattered, and men from the North Camp did not always come in. Through all of it, the waiting room continued to exist in a state of unmanaged uncertainty. There was no one to tell the next patient how long the wait would be. There was no one to offer water to the Henderson boy when he stopped crying and went pale in the way children went pale when they had been crying hard and were now simply exhausted. There was no one to notice that the woman with the cough had left her scarf on the chair and would want it when she stepped out into the February cold. Edmund noticed the scarf on his way back from the supply cabinet. He picked it up and held it and did not know what to do with it, and put it on the desk and went back to the examination room. At 2 in the afternoon, between patients, he sat at Constance's desk. He sat in her chair, which was lower than he expected. She was shorter than he was, and she had adjusted it, and he had never sat in it before, and so had never known. He looked at the surface of the desk. He looked at the ledger, open to Wednesday, and at the notations he could not fully read. He looked at the small calendar she had kept beside the ledger, on which she had written not only appointments, but small reminders to herself. Morphine, check. Henderson files, Mrs. Paulson, gauze. He looked at the hook behind the door. There were 3 keys on it. He had installed the hook. He had never looked at it. He put his elbows on the desk and his face in his hands and sat there for a moment that was not long enough to be called a breakdown and was too long to be called nothing. Then he straightened. He picked up a pen. He opened the ledger to a fresh page, not Wednesday's page, a fresh page at the back, and he began to write down what he did not know. It was a long list. It took him a quarter of an hour, and he was not finished when Mrs. Paulson arrived for her dressings, and he put down the pen and went to the door. Mrs. Paulson was 67, and she had a wound on her left leg that was healing, slowly, but healing, and she had been coming every Thursday for 6 weeks. She looked at the waiting room, which was empty now, and at the empty desk, and at Edmund standing in the doorway to the examination room. "Thursday's my day," she said, with mild suspicion. "I know," Edmund said. "You're a day early, Mrs. Paulson." She considered this. "Am I?" "Come in," he said. "I'll see to the leg." He saw to the leg. He used the good gauze and then stopped and switched to the other, remembering Constance's list. Mrs. Paulson did not notice, or if she noticed, she did not say. When she left, Edmund went back to the desk and added to his list. Who decides what patients can pay and who cannot, and on what basis, and where is that written down? He stared at it, then he added, "It is probably not written down anywhere." By 4 o'clock, the waiting room was empty and the day was not finished, and Edmund was sitting again at Constance's desk, looking at the supply inventory she had kept in a cloth-bound notebook in the second drawer, which he had found by opening all the drawers in order, which had taken him longer than it should have. The inventory was dated. She had been updating it every 2 weeks, he could see. The last entry was 8 days ago, which meant there would have been another entry this coming Saturday, which meant she had known on Saturday that she would be gone by Tuesday and had updated the inventory anyway, because the inventory needed to be updated regardless of what she was going to do. He sat with that for a moment. He thought about a woman who updates the supply inventory 8 days before she leaves because the work needs doing whether or not she is the one who will ultimately need it. He thought about the candlesticks. He thought about the hook behind the door. He was still sitting there, the inventory open in his lap, and the list of what he did not know growing on the ledger page before him when he heard the front door. He looked up. It was after hours. He had not locked the front door because Constance had locked the front door, and he did not know where the key was kept, and it was not on the hook behind the door, and he had not thought to look further. The woman who stepped through the door was not a patient. She did not have the particular quality of a person who has come to a doctor's office with something wrong with them. That careful, slightly diminished posture, the body already making concessions to its own vulnerability. She stood straight. She looked at the waiting room with the direct, appraising look of a person taking inventory, and her eyes moved across the empty desk and the out-of-order chairs and the Henderson boy's forgotten toy on the windowsill. He had left a small wooden horse. Edmund had noticed it and not known what to do with it. And she looked at Edmund, sitting in his dead wife's chair with an inventory in his lap and a list of his own ignorance open on the desk before him. She was perhaps 30, perhaps a little older. She wore a dark coat that had been good once and was still decent. Her face was composed in a way that was not coldness, but something more deliberate than warmth. She looked at him the way Edmund looked at a patient's presenting symptoms, not unkindly, but without pretense about what she was seeing. "The door was unlocked," she said. "Yes," Edmund said. She looked at the desk, at the ledger, at the inventory in his hands. "Are you the doctor?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer and was asking for other reasons. "I am," Edmund said. She nodded once. She looked again at the waiting room, at the chairs, at the desk, at the small wooden horse on the windowsill, and something in her expression shifted, very slightly, in the way that a person's expression shifts when they have looked at a problem and understood it completely. "I'll come back in the morning," she said, and before Edmund could ask her name, or what she needed, or why she had come at 4:15 on a Wednesday to a doctor's office that had been quietly unraveling since Tuesday, she turned and walked back out through the unlocked door, and the cold February air came in behind her and stirred the papers on Constance's desk, and Edmund sat very still and looked at the doorway where she had been. He did not know her, but he recognized, with the diagnostic instinct that was the best thing about him, and sometimes the only good thing, that she had not come in as a patient. She had come in the way a person comes in when they are considering whether a place is worth the trouble of saving. The cold came in first. Josephine Blunt had a habit of arriving before she was expected, not from eagerness, which she distrusted, but from the practical conviction that if you wanted to see a place honestly, you came before it had time to compose itself. She had learned this at 14, when composure became something she watched other people perform, and at 31, she had no patience left for performances she could see through. She stood on the front step of Dr. Edmund Farrow's practice at 20 minutes past 7 on a Thursday morning and tried the door which was unlocked, which told her something. She filed it away beside the other things she had already noticed. The sign in the window that had been turned to closed but not straightened, so it hung at an angle that suggested haste or distraction. The mat outside the door that was saturated with tracked snow and had not been shaken out in at least 2 days. The fact that the brass plate reading E.J. Farrow, M.D., was newly polished, someone's pride recently exercised. But the glass in the door had a smear at shoulder height that had been there long enough to dry. She pushed the door open and went in. The waiting room was cold and smelled of wood smoke and something antiseptic underneath. 4 chairs lined the left wall, and a small table held a stack of periodicals that had been straightened into a neat pile, which she suspected was not the doctor's doing. There was a desk near the inner door, a woman's desk, she thought, not from any quality of the wood, but from the way the surface had been organized, with a logic that spoke of someone who had to keep many things in her head at once and had built a physical system to hold what her head could not always carry. The system was still there. The person who had built it was not. Josephine set her bag on the floor and began to look. She had heard about the Farrow situation from Mrs. Aldred at the post office, who had heard it from her nephew, who had a broken collarbone and an appointment on Wednesday that had not gone smoothly in the administrative sense. Mrs. Aldred had relayed this information with the particular energy of a woman who considers the distribution of community intelligence to be a civic duty, and Josephine had listened with the particular patience of a woman who was calculating something. She had been calculating for 6 weeks, since Thomas Blunt had been buried in the churchyard on the hill with a modest stone and an immodest debt that was now, in the eyes of the law and the bank, entirely hers. Thomas had been a kind man and a poor manager of money, and Josephine had loved him honestly, without ever being blind to the second fact. She had tried, in the last years of their marriage, to quietly correct for his deficiencies without making him feel corrected, which was its own kind of invisible labor. And she had done it well enough that the extent of the problem had not become clear to either of them until it was too late to do much about it. She did not blame him. She understood now the particular tragedy of a person who cannot see their own limitations until someone else is made to carry them. She needed work. She needed work that paid enough to matter and that used the things she was actually good at. And she had learned to be precise about what those things were, because imprecision in self-assessment was a luxury she could not afford. She was good at systems. She was good at the management of information, the organization of competing demands, the maintenance of order in conditions that did not naturally tend toward it. She was good at reading rooms and reading people, and she was good at the particular skill of making complicated things look simple, which was not simplicity, but its opposite, was, in fact, the most demanding kind of competence, because it required you to absorb complexity entirely and then present only the smooth surface of it. She did not know if she wanted to work for a doctor, but she knew, standing in the cold waiting room of Edmund Farrow's practice on a Thursday morning, that she was looking at a system she understood. The bones of it were good. The bones of it were, in fact, excellent. She could see that from the structure of the desk alone, from the logic of the filing system visible through the half-open door to the records room. Someone had built something genuinely well here. Someone had then left. Josephine picked up the stack of periodicals, straightened it properly, and set it back down. "You're not a patient." She turned. Edmund Farrow was standing in the doorway to the interior of the house, still in his shirt sleeves, and he was looking at her the way she had looked at the desk, with an attention that was trying to classify her. He had dark circles under his eyes that spoke of 2 nights of poor sleep, and there was something around his mouth that was not quite embarrassment and not quite relief, and was probably both. "No," she said, "I'm Josephine Blunt, Mrs. Thomas Blunt, recently. I came about the office." "There's no advertisement." "No," she agreed. He looked at her for a moment. "How did you know there was a position?" "Mrs. Aldred at the post office said your Wednesday appointments ran 40 minutes behind, and you sent a patient home without billing him." Something moved across his face. "I didn't send him home without—" He stopped. "He left. He left before I had worked out—" He stopped again. "I gave him the splint at no charge. It seemed the right decision under the circumstances." "It was a fine decision for the patient," Josephine said. "It was a poor decision for your accounts. I'm aware of that. Are you aware that you have 7 appointments today beginning at 8 o'clock, and that your appointment book is currently on the floor behind the desk?" He looked at the desk. He looked at the floor behind it. He said nothing. "I found it when I came in," she said, and left it at that, because she saw no reason to add that it had been face down with a coffee ring on the back cover, which told her exactly what kind of night he had had. She had not been in the room 5 minutes when the girl appeared. She came down the interior staircase quietly, the kind of quiet that is not accidental, that is the product of long practice. And she stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Josephine with a directness that Josephine recognized immediately as intelligence presenting itself without apology. She was perhaps 12, dark-haired, with her father's watchful eyes set in what must have been her mother's face, and she was wearing her school clothes already, which meant she had been up for some time, which meant she had heard something and come to assess it. "Celia," Edmund said, "you should be at breakfast." "I had breakfast," Celia said. She did not look at her father when she said it. She was looking at Josephine. Josephine looked back. She had been looked at by children in this particular way before. The assessing look, the look that was doing rapid and serious work behind its stillness. And she had learned not to soften herself for it, because children who looked at you that way did not want softening. They wanted to see what you actually were. "I'm Josephine Blunt," she said, in the same tone she had used for the father. "I know," Celia said. "Your husband died in January. Mr. Mabry at the chemist's said he owed your husband money, and that he didn't know who to pay now." Edmund made a sound. "Celia." "It's accurate," Josephine said. "Mr. Mabry does owe that money. I've written to him about it." Celia considered this. "Did he write back?" "Not yet." "He won't," Celia said, with the certainty of someone who has observed Mr. Mabry at the chemist's for 12 years and drawn her conclusions. "He paid my mother in kind when he couldn't pay the bill. She let him because she knew he'd never manage cash." She paused. She kept a separate ledger for it. The room was very quiet. Edmund was looking at his daughter with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite pain, but lived in the country between them. "A separate ledger," Josephine said. "In the supply room. On the second shelf, behind the carbolic. Celia's voice was perfectly steady. I know where everything is. She showed me. Josephine looked at the girl for a long moment. She thought about 14, and the things you learn at 14, and the particular weight of knowledge that is given to you by someone who is trying to prepare you for their own absence. She thought about the careful logic of that desk, and the person who had built it, and the daughter standing at the bottom of the stairs who had been watching all of it for 12 years and filing it away in the same precise way. Good, Josephine said. That's useful to know. The first patient arrived at 3 minutes to 8. Josephine was behind the desk. She had found the appointment book and the billing ledger and Constance Farrow's instruction list, all 3 pages of it, written in a hand so clear and organized it made something tighten in her chest that she did not examine closely. And she had spent 25 minutes reading them with the focused attention she brought to any new system, learning its logic, finding its gaps, noting the 2 places where the system assumed knowledge that was not written down anywhere because the person who had built it had not thought to write it down, because she had never imagined she would not be there to supply it herself. Edmund had gone to prepare the examination room. Celia had gone to school, but she had paused at the door and looked back at Josephine with that same assessing stillness, and Josephine had nodded once, and Celia had nodded once in return, and that had been, in its way, the most complete conversation Josephine had had in 6 weeks. The patient was an older man with a chest cough and the look of someone who had been putting off this appointment for a fortnight. He came in stamping snow from his boots and stopped when he saw Josephine. Mrs. Farrow, he said, with the uncertainty of a man who is not sure what he is seeing. No, Josephine said. Mrs. Blunt, take a seat, please. Dr. Farrow will be with you shortly. She opened the appointment book to confirm his name. Mr. Hatch? That's right. He sat. He looked at her with the same question still in his face, but she had already looked back down at the ledger, and the question subsided. She found the billing rate for a chest examination. She found the notes Constance had kept on Mr. Hatch's last 3 visits, which included the information that he always claimed to be worse than he was, and also that he was allergic to quinine, and also that he preferred to be addressed formally and found it rude when doctors used his first name without invitation. She set a clean card beside the ledger and wrote the relevant information on it in her own hand. The second patient arrived at 8:08, the third at 20 past. By 8:30, there were 4 people in the waiting room, and Josephine had spoken to each of them, recorded their names, located their files, and noted the specific things that Constance's records told her would be useful to know. She did not think about whether she had the job yet. She thought about the job. At 9 o'clock, Edmund came out between patients and stopped in the doorway and looked at the waiting room, at the 4 people sitting in an order that was not the order in which they had arrived, which meant she had triaged them, which meant she had made a medical judgment she was not qualified to make, and which was, in fact, entirely correct. And then he looked at Josephine. She was writing something in the margin of Constance's instruction list, corrections, additions, the places where the system needed updating. She did not look up. Mrs. Blunt, he said. Mr. Hatch has a productive cough and a temperature, she said, still writing. He told me it was nothing, but he's been holding his ribs when he breathes. Mrs. Pell is second. She's been waiting longest, and she's anxious. She keeps counting the chairs. The boy with his mother can wait. It's his ear. It's been a week already, so another 20 minutes won't hurt him. She paused. The man by the window is not on the appointment book. He came in while you were with Mr. Hatch. I told him I'd see if you had time. Edmund was quiet for a moment. "Do I have time?" he asked. "Not really," she said. "But you'll make time, because he's walked here, and his left boot is worn through, and he's been sitting very still, the way people sit when moving hurts." She looked up then. He was looking at her with the expression she had seen the day before through the glass, the one that was not quite relief and not quite something else. And this time she could see it more clearly. And what it was, she thought, was recognition. The particular recognition of a man who has been alone with a problem long enough to forget that problems can be shared. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to make her point, and then she looked back down. "Send Mr. Hatch in," she said. "I'll manage the room." He went. She managed the room. And at the desk, in the margin of a dead woman's instruction list, she wrote the first of what would become 47 amendments. Small corrections, quiet additions, the incremental work of someone building a system of her own on the foundation of someone else's, and did not yet know quite what she was building, or whether the man who watched her from doorways understood that she was building it for herself as much as for him. She would have to make that clear. She was already composing how. The number Edmund offered was an embarrassment even as he said it. He had arrived at it the way he arrived at most things that required him to consider money outside of billing, which is to say, he had not arrived at it at all. He had simply reached into the approximate space where he believed wages lived and produced a figure. And the figure he produced was the sort of thing a man offers when he has not thought seriously about the matter, but wishes to appear as though he has. £2 a week, he said. To start. He had said to start because it implied generosity without committing to it, and because he was standing in the doorway of his own records room at 7:20 on a Thursday morning, watching a woman he did not know reorganize his filing system with the calm efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years, and he did not know what else to say. Josephine Blunt did not look up from the folder she was holding. "No," she said. Edmund blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no." She set the folder down, squared it against the edge of the desk with a small, precise movement, and then looked at him directly. She had a face that was not beautiful in any way that required acknowledgement, but it was the kind of face that made you feel, when it was turned fully toward you, that you had better have something worth saying. £2 is what you pay a girl to run errands and answer a door. I am not a girl, Dr. Farrow, and what you need is not someone to answer a door. He stopped. He had not been contradicted with such composure since medical school, and even then it had been by men who wore their authority like a garment and required you to recognize it. This was different. This was a woman standing in his records room at 7:20 in a gray wool dress that was good but not new, contradicting him as though the matter were already settled and she was simply informing him of the outcome. "What would you consider appropriate, then?" £4.10 a week. Fixed. Not to start. Fixed. Edmund opened his mouth and closed it again. That's very nearly what I know what you earn, she said. I found your billing ledger. You've been undercharging for house calls by approximately 30% for the past 2 years, and you've not billed 3 patients at all, which I suspect is because you forgot rather than because you intended charity. She paused. Did you intend charity? The Marsh family, I'll leave the Marsh family as they are, she said, as though this were her decision to make. The others I'll invoice this week, with a note that attributes the delay to administrative reorganization, which is accurate. Once I have corrected the billing structure, £4.10 will represent less than you imagine. Edmund stood in the doorway for a moment longer. He was a man who was good at reading bodies. The hitch in a breath that preceded bad news, the way a hand held itself when something hurt more than the patient admitted. And he was reading Josephine Blunt now, with the same attention he gave a patient whose symptoms didn't yet resolve into a clear picture. What he found was a woman who was not performing composure. She was simply composed. The difference was the difference between a coat worn against the cold and skin. "You've been here less than an hour," he said finally. "An hour and 20 minutes. I arrived at 7. She glanced at the clock on the mantel, a small brass thing that Constance had kept wound. "The first patient is at 8:30. I'd like to understand the appointment system before then, and I'll need you to explain what you use the 3rd drawer for, because nothing in Mrs. Farrow's notes accounts for it, and I've looked through it twice." "Mrs. Farrow," Edmund said, and something shifted in his expression that he did not intend to show. "You know about—" "I know she maintained this practice. I know she's gone." Josephine's voice did not change register. "I'm not asking about that. I'm asking about the 3rd drawer." The 3rd drawer, it emerged, contained nothing that required a drawer. There were 3 pens that no longer worked, a letter Edmund had begun to a colleague in Edinburgh and never finished, a paperweight shaped like a sleeping dog that had been a gift from a patient, and a packet of peppermints that had hardened into a single fused mass. Josephine looked at these items in the drawer and then looked at Edmund. "I'll clear it," she said. "The paperweight was a gift," he said, which was not an objection exactly. "I'll put it on the windowsill." She lifted it out and set it on the sill between the window and the stack of medical journals. It looked better there. Edmund noted this and said nothing. They spent the next 40 minutes going through the appointment book, which Josephine had already partially decoded, and the billing system, which she had almost entirely decoded, and the supply inventory, which she had not yet touched, but had noted was in a state she described as workable but inefficient. Edmund answered her questions and found that answering them was, oddly, less painful than he had anticipated. She did not ask why things were the way they were. She only asked what they were and what they needed to become. At 8:15, Edmund made tea without being asked to, and brought her a cup, and she accepted it without comment, which he found he preferred to gratitude. The boy appeared at 8:47. Edmund's son Thomas was 8 years old and small for his age, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's habit of going very still when he was thinking. He had come down the back stairs from the living quarters above the practice, the staircase that connected the household to the office through a door that was meant to stay closed during surgery hours, and he stood in the doorway between the records room and the waiting room with his hands in the pockets of his school jacket, and his gaze fixed on Josephine with an intensity that was not hostile, but was not quite comfortable either. Josephine was managing the waiting room, which currently held 2 patients. Garrett Sully, who had returned for Edmund to check the splint on his wrist, and a woman named Mrs. Alderton, who had brought her daughter in for a persistent cough. Josephine was explaining to Mrs. Alderton that the doctor would be with them shortly, and she did not break off mid-sentence when Thomas appeared, but she did, Edmund noticed this from the hallway, shift her weight slightly, the way a person does when they have registered something in their peripheral vision and are deciding what to do about it. She finished her sentence to Mrs. Alderton. Then she turned and looked at Thomas directly, the same way she had looked at Edmund, fully, without hurry. Thomas did not speak. Josephine did not speak either for a moment. Then she said, "You're Thomas." He said nothing. "The door from the stairs is meant to stay closed during surgery hours," she said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was not softened either. It was simply a fact being stated to someone she was crediting with the intelligence to receive facts. "Your father's with a patient. You can wait in the kitchen, or you can go back up." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression of someone taking a measurement. Then he turned and went back through the door, which he closed behind him with a precision that was, Edmund thought, its own form of response. The morning passed in the way mornings pass when a system is being built. Unevenly, with small corrections, with moments of unexpected smoothness, followed by snags that had to be worked out on the spot. Josephine sent Garrett Sully in to see Edmund without prompting at the right moment. She explained to Mrs. Alderton's daughter, who was 7 and frightened of doctors, that the room smelled like medicine because medicine was what kept people well, and that the smell was therefore a good smell, and the girl considered this and agreed. She found the supply of receipt paper that Constance had noted in her instructions and that Edmund had been unable to locate because it was in the cabinet behind the door that swung outward and obscured the bottom shelf when open. At 11:30, when the last patient had gone and Edmund was writing up his notes, Josephine came to the door of his consulting room. "I'll need a key," she said. Edmund looked up. "I beg your pardon?" "A key to the practice. If I'm to open in the mornings, and the mornings are when I can do the administrative work without interruption, I'll need a key." She paused. "Mrs. Farrow's key is presumably wherever Mrs. Farrow is." There was a silence. Edmund set down his pen. He thought about Constance's key on the kitchen table, the sound it had made when he'd picked it up, which was no sound at all, just the small weight of a thing being lifted. He thought about the letter and the 2 pages of it, and the part he kept returning to, which was not the accusations. There were no accusations, but the line that said, "I have been invisible to you for so long that I have become invisible to myself, and I cannot afford to disappear entirely." "I'll have 1 cut," he said. Josephine nodded. She turned to go. "Mrs. Blunt." She stopped. "The terms," he said. £4.10, fixed." He said it the way she had said it, not as a question, not as a concession, but as an acknowledgment of a thing already settled. I'll need a week to reorganize the billing before I can confirm the cash flow supports it, but the terms are agreed." Josephine looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read, which was unusual for him. Then she said, "I know it supports it. I told you. You've been undercharging for house calls." "Yes," Edmund said. "You did tell me that." She left. Edmund sat for a moment in the quiet of his consulting room with his pen in his hand and the notes half finished before him. And he thought about what it meant that a woman had come into his practice this morning and negotiated her own wages and reorganized his filing system and managed his patients and spoken plainly to his son, and that at no point had he felt the discomfort he would have expected to feel at any of it. He felt, instead, something closer to relief, which he did not entirely trust. That evening, he found a stone on the corner of Josephine's desk. It was smooth and dark gray, the kind of stone that comes from a riverbed, rounded by water into something almost perfect. It had been placed with some care at the corner nearest the door, as though left for someone who would understand what it meant. Edmund picked it up and turned it over in his hand. He set it back exactly where he'd found it. He did not know, then, that Thomas had been watching from the top of the back stairs all afternoon, studying the new woman with her gray dress and her precise movements and her voice that said things plainly and did not soften them into shapes that required interpretation. He did not know that his son had sat at the kitchen table after dinner with his rock collection spread before him and selected, with the seriousness of a diplomat choosing a gift for a head of state, the smoothest and most perfect of them. He did not know that Thomas had come down the stairs at 5:30 when the practice was empty, and placed the stone on her desk, and then gone back up without a sound. He did not know any of this, but upstairs in his son's room, Thomas was lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling, with the particular expression of a child who has done something that cannot be undone, and is not certain yet whether that is good or terrible. He had left her something. She would come back in the morning and find it. What happened after that was beyond his control, which was, he was discovering, the terrifying and necessary condition of wanting anything at all. Josephine arrived the next morning at 7, and the stone was where she had left it, which meant someone had found it and left it, which meant something. And she stood looking at it for a moment before she opened the appointment book. And for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something that was not grief and not necessity, but some third thing she did not yet have a name for. The first patient of the morning was a boy of 7 with an ear infection, and while Dr. Farrow examined him in the back room, Josephine wrote the appointment entry in the book, with the same deliberate hand she had used to write everything since she was 14, which was the year her mother took to bed and did not get up again, not for 3 years, and someone had to know where the rent money was kept. She dated the entry. She noted the complaint. She wrote Farrow E. in the column for the attending physician, because that was how records were kept. And records were kept so that when you needed to find something, you could find it, and not before. The boy's name was Albert Fenn. She wrote that too. Harriet Odom came in at 9:30, which was when the post office opened, and therefore when Harriet could leave it. And she came in the way she always came in everywhere, which was as though she had been invited and was only slightly late. She was 63 and wore her gray hair pinned so severely that it seemed less a hairstyle than a structural decision. And she looked at Josephine behind the reception desk the way a woman looks at a piece of furniture that has been moved 2 inches to the left. Not disapproving exactly, but noting the change with the full attention it deserved. "You're not Mrs. Farrow?" Harriet said. "No," said Josephine. Harriet sat down in the nearest chair and set her bag on her lap. "Hip," she said, by way of explaining her presence. "Gives me trouble in the cold. Dr. Farrow gives me a rub of something that smells like a ship's hold and tells me to walk more, which I consider contradictory advice. But I've been coming here 11 years, so I suppose I'll keep coming." "I'll note it as an existing complaint," Josephine said, and wrote Odom, H. Hip, recurring in the appointment ledger. "He'll be with you shortly." Harriet watched her write it. "You have good handwriting," she said, as though this were a moral quality. "I was taught by someone who believed bad handwriting was a form of rudeness." "They were right." Harriet paused. "Who are you, then?" What she had learned at 14, the first thing, was that a household was a system, and systems did not run themselves, and the people who ran them were almost never the people who were thanked for anything. Her mother had run their household, a narrow terrace house in Guildford, 3 children, a father who worked at the print works and came home tired and kind and largely absent. And when her mother could no longer run it, Josephine had understood for the first time what running it had actually meant. It had meant knowing which bills came on the 1st of the month and which came on the 15th. It had meant knowing that the butcher would extend credit if you were polite and consistent, but not if you were late twice in a row. It had meant keeping her brother Marcus from spending the housekeeping on cigarettes, and her sister Edna from giving it away to anyone who asked, and their father from simply forgetting it existed. It had meant being the person who remembered, in a house full of people who needed someone to remember. She had not resented it. That was the thing she had never been able to explain to anyone, including Thomas, who had asked her once why she never seemed angry about it. She had not resented it, because resentment required believing that something had been taken from you, and she had never experienced it that way. She had experienced it as a fact of the world, like weather. You could be angry at rain, but it remained rain. What she had learned was that competence was a kind of shelter. The more she knew how to do, the less the world could do to her without her permission. "My name is Josephine Blunt," she told Harriet Odom. "I manage the practice." Harriet absorbed this. "Since when?" "Since Thursday." "This is Friday." "Yes." Harriet looked at the waiting room. The chairs aligned, the table cleared of its previous disorder, the appointment book open and evidently in use. She looked at Josephine. "What happened to Mrs. Farrow?" "I couldn't say." "Couldn't or won't?" Josephine met her eyes. "Mrs. Odom, Harriet." "Harriet, I have been here since yesterday morning. I know very little about Mrs. Farrow's circumstances, and nothing that would be appropriate for me to share. What I can tell you is that the practice is open. Dr. Farrow is seeing patients, and your appointment is at 10:30. Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're a widow?" Josephine went still. "The ring," Harriet said, not unkindly. "You're wearing it still, but you've moved it to your right hand. That's either widowhood or divorce. And you don't have the look of a woman who was left. You have the look of a woman who lost something." There was a long pause. Outside, the street was doing its ordinary Friday business. A cart going past, someone calling to someone else. The particular sound of a town that did not know it was being listened to. "Recent?" Harriet asked. "6 weeks," said Josephine. Harriet nodded once, the way a woman nods when she is filing information in a place she will not lose it. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and meant it in a way that was not performative, which Josephine recognized because she had heard it performed so many times in the past 6 weeks that the genuine article was startling by contrast. "Thank you," Josephine said. The second thing she had learned at 14 was that most people, given the choice between understanding a system and trusting someone else to understand it for them, would choose the latter every time. This was not laziness exactly. It was something more like relief. People were tired. People had enough to manage in the parts of their lives they could see without also learning the parts they couldn't. And so they trusted. And the person they trusted had better be worth trusting, because the alternative was what she had found in Thomas's desk after the funeral. The ledgers she had not known existed, the debts she had not known he carried, the careful architecture of a man who had trusted himself to manage things and had been wrong. She did not think Edmund Farrow was that kind of man. She thought he was a different kind, the kind who simply hadn't looked, because looking had never been required of him, the kind who would look now if someone showed him where to look. Whether that made him better or worse, she hadn't decided yet. At 11 o'clock, between patients, she found a discrepancy in the billing ledger that dated back 4 months. Someone, Constance, she assumed, though she was beginning to understand that Constance's systems had been meticulous in some areas and quietly desperate in others, had been entering supply costs twice, once under materials and once under sundries, which meant the monthly expense tallies were inflated by a figure that, over 4 months, amounted to nearly £3. She noted it on a separate sheet of paper with the relevant dates and entries. She would show it to Edmund at the end of the day. She did not feel triumphant about finding it. She felt the same thing she had always felt when she found an error in a system. A small, precise satisfaction, like a key fitting a lock. The satisfaction of the world being slightly more knowable than it had been 5 minutes ago. Harriet Odom reappeared at the reception desk at 11:10, having seen the doctor, smelling faintly of the ship's hold rub, and in no apparent hurry to leave. "He told me to walk more again," she said.
"Did he?" "I told him I walked to the post office and back every day, and he said that doesn't count, which I also consider contradictory." She set her bag down on the desk, which Josephine noted but did not comment on. "How are you finding Harlan Creek?" "I've been here since Thursday." "That's long enough to form an impression." Josephine considered this. "It seems like a town that knows itself," she said carefully. "It knows everyone else," Harriet said. "Whether it knows itself is another question. You'll be talked about, you understand. A strange woman turning up the day after Constance Farrow leaves and taking over her desk. That's a story people will make something of. People can make what they like of it. That's the right answer, Harriet said, with something that in a less severe face might have been approval. The wrong answer would have been to care, or to pretend not to care, which is worse. She picked up her bag. I come in every second Friday, hip permitting. I'll put you in the book. Do. Harriet moved toward the door, then paused without turning around. The Granger house on Mill Lane has a room to let.
Clean, reasonable. The landlady is deaf in one ear, so she won't hear you come in late, if you're looking. Josephine had been staying at the inn on the high street, which cost more than she wanted to spend and smelled of boiled cabbage after 6 in the evening. She had not mentioned this to anyone.
I wasn't aware I'd said anything about my living situation, she said.
You didn't, Harriet said. But you've been wearing the same blouse 2 days running, which means either you haven't unpacked or you're traveling light, and women who travel light are usually traveling somewhere. She opened the door. Cold air came in briefly. Mill Lane, Mrs. Granger. Tell her Harriet sent you. The door closed. Josephine looked at the appointment book. She looked at the closed door. She thought about what it meant to be read that accurately by someone who had known her for less than 2 hours, and whether it was alarming or something else. Whether it was, in fact, something close to the feeling she'd had that morning when she found the stone still on the step. She wrote Odom H. in the book for the second Friday of next month. Then she went back to the discrepancy. What she had learned at 14, the last thing, the thing that had taken the longest to understand, the work was not the point. The work was what you did. The point was what the work made possible. Her mother getting better, her brother keeping his job, her sister finishing school, her father coming home to a house that was still a house. The point was always something outside the work itself. She was still learning what the point was here. She was beginning to think she might find out. At 4:30, Edmund came out of the back room with the last patient's file and stopped when he saw the separate sheet of paper she had placed on the desk, weighted with the small stone she had brought in from the step that morning, and set in the upper right corner without quite deciding to. He looked at the sheet. He looked at the stone. He did not ask about the stone, which she thought showed a kind of intelligence. "What's this?" he said, picking up the paper. "A billing error, 4 months running. You've been overstating your supply costs by double entry. I've marked the relevant ledger pages." She paused. It would have compounded over time. He read the sheet. His expression did something she couldn't quite name. Not embarrassment exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that was also, she thought, the beginning of a reckoning. "How did you find this?" he said. "I read carefully." He set the paper down. He looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't quite managed in the first 2 days, the way people didn't look at the person managing things until something went wrong. "Mrs. Blunt," he said, "what else have you found?" She held his gaze for a moment. "I think," she said, "you should sit down." She had 3 more pages of notes, and at the bottom of the billing ledger, in Constance Farrow's careful handwriting, she had found a name she did not recognize. Written not in the records column, not in the accounts column, but in the margin, in pencil, very small,
as though written not to be found, but not quite brought to be destroyed. She had not shown him that page yet. She was not yet certain she should. The name in the margin stayed with her through Friday. Josephine had not shown Edmund the page.
She had closed the ledger with her thumb, marking the place, then opened it again to a different page and spent the next hour going through the outstanding invoices, as though the margin note were simply a smudge, a stray mark, something the eye had caught and the mind had misread. She had not misread it. The handwriting was too deliberate for that, small and careful, each letter formed with the particular precision of a woman who had once been told her penmanship was her best quality and had never forgotten it. Not written in haste, written in the way one writes something one has thought about for a long time. She had not shown him. She told herself this was professional judgment, that it was not her place to introduce into a working arrangement something that might be personal, might be nothing, might be the kind of private notation that belonged entirely to a woman who was no longer present to explain it. She told herself she was waiting until she understood it better. She was not certain she believed herself. Saturday came and went without incident. Sunday, Josephine attended service at St. Cuthbert's, as she had every Sunday since Thomas's funeral, sitting in the third pew on the left, where she and Thomas had always sat, and where she now sat alone, which the congregation had by now largely stopped remarking upon, having moved their remarking to other things. On Monday, she arrived at 10 minutes past 7 and found Edmund already in the records room, which meant he had slept badly again. He looked up when she came in, and she noted the particular quality of his expression, not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who has spent the weekend confronting what he doesn't know and is grateful to be in the presence of someone who does. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." She set down her bag, removed her coat, and hung it on the hook she had designated as hers on Thursday. She had not asked his permission for this. He had not objected. "I thought," he said, "we might go through the patient files, the ones Constance organized by her own system. I've been trying to understand it." "We will," Josephine said, "after morning appointments." He nodded. He had, she noticed, stopped arguing about the sequencing of tasks. The morning appointments were routine until Reverend Silas Pruitt arrived at 10:30. He was a large man, Reverend Pruitt, not fat but substantial, with the kind of physical presence that filled a doorway without quite meaning to, the way certain pieces of furniture fill a room. 55, perhaps, with a white collar and a good coat and the expression of a man who had long since made his peace with being listened to. He was not unkind. This was the thing about him that made him difficult. He was genuinely not unkind. His concern for the people in his parish was real. His willingness to act on that concern was real. His understanding of what the people in his parish actually needed was, Josephine had concluded within 30 seconds of his entering the waiting room, rather more limited. He came in, removed his hat, and looked at her. She looked back. "Good morning," she said. "Have you an appointment, Reverend Pruitt?" He paused. The pause was not surprise exactly. He had heard, she suspected, that there was a new woman at the practice, because in a town of this size there was no such thing as information that did not travel. But the pause had in it the quality of a man recalibrating,
seeing the thing in front of him and matching it against the version he had constructed in his head. "I do not," he said. "I was hoping Dr. Farrow might have a moment." "He has a patient with him at present. If you'd like to wait, I can let him know you're here, or I can schedule you for tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. There's a gap." "I'll wait, I think." "Of course." She gestured to the chairs. "Please sit down." He sat. She returned to the ledger. The waiting room was otherwise occupied by Mrs. Fenwick, who had a cough, and young Daniel Ames, who had come on behalf of his mother and was reading a 3-month-old newspaper with the focused attention of someone who had not yet learned to pretend he wasn't listening. For 3 minutes, Reverend Pruitt was quiet. Then, "You are Mrs. Blunt." "I am." "Thomas Blunt's wife." "His widow," Josephine said without looking up. Another pause. "I was sorry for your loss." Thomas was a good man. He was. This was true. She said it without qualification because it required none. "I understand you've taken a position here." "I manage the practice, yes." "Since Thursday." She looked up at that. "Since Thursday," she confirmed. Reverend Pruitt turned his hat in his hands, not nervously but thoughtfully, the gesture of a man who was composing something. "I wonder," he said, "whether I might ask after Mrs. Farrow." "You might ask Dr. Farrow." "I intend to. I wondered whether that is, whether you know where she's gone." Josephine set down her pen. She gave him her full attention, which she had found was often more effective than any particular response. People, when given full attention, tended to reveal more precisely what they meant. "I've worked here 4 days, Reverend Pruitt," she said. "I know what the appointment book says and what the billing ledger says. Mrs. Farrow's whereabouts are not recorded in either." "No," he said. "No, I suppose not." He looked at the hat. "It is only that there is concern in the parish about the nature of the arrangement." "The arrangement," Josephine said. "A woman, alone."
Working in close quarters with a man whose marriage has recently. He stopped, reconsidered. "Dr. Farrow is a respectable man. I don't question that, but appearances—" "Reverend Pruitt," her voice was even, "I am a widow of 31. I am employed in a professional capacity to manage the administrative functions of a medical practice. I arrive at 7 in the morning and I leave at 6 in the evening. During those hours, I sit at a desk in the waiting room, manage the appointment book, maintain the billing records, and ensure that patients are seen in the correct order. Dr. Farrow examines his patients in an examination room with a door. I am not in the examination room." He had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I understand that. Of course I understand that. It is only that a woman working is easier to worry about than whatever caused Mrs. Farrow to leave," Josephine said. The room was very quiet. Young Daniel Ames had stopped pretending to read the newspaper. Mrs. Fenwick's cough, which had been a persistent background percussion, ceased entirely. Reverend Pruitt looked at her steadily. He was not a foolish man. He knew when he had been read accurately, and he knew when the person doing the reading had earned the right to say so. "That," he said slowly, "is perhaps not entirely fair." "Perhaps not,"
Josephine agreed, "but I find it is often true." Edmund came out of the examination room at 11:20, saw Pruitt, and his expression shifted through 3 distinct phases in rapid succession. Recognition, something that was not quite guilt, and then the particular composure of a man who has been practicing composure since Tuesday. "Silas," he said, "come through." Josephine watched them go. She handed Mrs. Fenwick a slip noting her appointment for the following Wednesday and told her to take the tincture twice daily, which she knew because Edmund had told her what to write, and because she had by now read enough of the patient records to understand the pattern of Mrs. Fenwick's treatment. She showed Daniel Ames how to fill out the form for his mother's repeat prescription. She did these things, and she listened, without appearing to listen, to the conversation in Edmund's office. The walls in the practice were not thick. She heard Pruitt's voice, low and measured. "The parish is talking, Edmund. I am not saying they are right to talk. I am saying they are talking." She heard Edmund's response, which was quieter. "And what would you have me do, Silas? The practice cannot run without someone managing it. It could not run with Constance, apparently. It certainly cannot run without anyone. You could find someone, a woman of more established years, perhaps, or a married woman whose husband— Josephine Blunt is the most competent person who has walked through that door in 4 years. She found 3 unbilled accounts on her first morning. She reorganized the filing system in an afternoon. She is a widow of good standing, whose husband I treated for 18 months, and I will not dismiss her because the parish is uncomfortable with the idea of a woman doing work that needs doing." A silence. Then Pruitt, more quietly, "You sound very certain of her." "I sound certain of the work she does." "Edmund," Pruitt's voice had changed quality, lower, more personal. "Where has Constance gone?" The longest silence. "I don't know," Edmund said. And then, after a moment, "I think she needed to go somewhere she hadn't been before. I think she had been— I think I did not—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't know how much she was carrying." Josephine looked down at the ledger. She thought about the name in the margin. She thought about Constance Farrow, whom she had never met, who had polished silver candlesticks that were never remarked upon, who had built and maintained a system that had run so smoothly no one had noticed it was a system at all, who had written something in a margin in pencil, very small, as though trying to keep a secret from herself. She thought, a woman who has been managing things since she was younger than she should have been knows exactly what that looks like in someone else. Pruitt left at noon. He paused at the front desk on his way out and looked at Josephine with the expression of a man who has revised his position and is not entirely certain how to announce the revision. "Mrs. Blunt," he said. "Reverend Pruitt, I want you to know that my concern was not a reflection of any doubt about your character." "I know," she said. And she did. This was the thing about him. He was not unkind. He was simply wrong about what mattered, and he was at least capable of knowing when he had been shown something he hadn't seen before. "I will speak to certain members of the parish," he said. "I believe I can address the concerns." "Thank you,"
she said, and meant it. He put on his hat and left. Edmund appeared in the doorway of his office. He looked at her. "You heard," he said. It was not a question. "The walls are not thick." He was quiet for a moment. "I meant what I said." "I know you did." She picked up the ledger. "Dr. Farrow, I need to show you something." He watched her open the ledger to the page she had been keeping her thumb against since Thursday. She turned it toward him and pointed to the margin, to the name written in Constance's careful hand, very small, in pencil, as though written not to be found, but not quite brought to be destroyed. He looked at it for a long moment. She watched his face. She had expected confusion. She had expected the blankness of a man confronting something unknown. What she saw instead was recognition. Slow, reluctant, arriving the way bad weather arrives, first as a change in the light, then as something you cannot any longer pretend is not coming. He knew the name. He sat down, not because she had asked him to, but because his legs appeared to have decided the matter independently. He sat, and he looked at the name in the margin, and he said nothing for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was entirely level, which Josephine had already learned was what Edmund Farrow's voice did when something was not level at all. "How long," he said, "has that been there?" The supply room was the size of a generous wardrobe and smelled of camphor and old paper and something underneath both that Josephine could not name, but recognized as the smell of things that had been left too long without being examined. She had not been asked to reorganize it. Edmund had not suggested it. The week had not demanded it, and Saturday was, technically, not her day. She had come in at 7:30 because the boarding house on Clement Street, where she let a room from Dottie Crane, had a broken boiler, and the common sitting room was full of men reading newspapers in their coats, and Josephine had found she could not think clearly in a room where everyone was pretending not to be cold. So she had come here instead. She stood in the doorway of the supply room for a moment before she touched anything, which was her habit. Looking first, understanding the shape of a disorder before deciding how to correct it was something she had learned at 14 and had never unlearned. You could not fix a thing you had only felt around the edges of in the dark. What she saw was not chaos. That was, in some ways, worse. What she saw was a system that had been logical once and had been slowly, incrementally abandoned, not through carelessness, but through accumulated urgency, through the steady pressure of a practice that kept growing while the person managing it absorbed the growth without complaint and without adjustment, because there had been no one to adjust for her. Constance Farrow, Josephine thought, again. She was always thinking about Constance Farrow in this building, which was not strange given that Constance Farrow had built the building's interior life from nothing. What was strange was that Josephine was beginning to think about her the way she thought about her mother in the last years, as a woman who had taken on more than a woman should have to take on alone, and who had done it so well that no one had noticed, and who had eventually stopped. She rolled up her sleeves. Dottie Crane had said, on the morning Josephine arrived with a trunk and a carpet bag, and the particular expression of a woman who had recently made a necessary decision, "You're the one going to work for Dr. Farrow." It had not been a question. Josephine had set down the carpet bag and said, "Yes." Dottie had looked at her for a moment,
Not rudely, but the way a woman who has run a boarding house for 20 years looks at people, which is to say, with the kind of attention that most people reserve for weather. Then she had said, "Rooms at the back, quieter."
You'll want quiet if you're managing Edmund Farrow's practice. You know him? Know everyone, Dottie had said, which was not boastful, merely accurate. Known him since he came to Harlan Creek. Known Constance since before that. She had paused, carrying one end of Josephine's trunk up the stairs with the efficiency of someone who has carried a great many trunks. She used to come in for tea, Wednesdays most weeks, when he had his long morning appointments and the afternoon was quiet. We'd sit in the kitchen because the parlor's for guests, and she wasn't a guest, she was— Another pause at the landing. She was someone I knew. Josephine had not asked what the distinction meant. She had understood it. She was good at managing him, Dottie had said at the door of the back room. Good at managing everything, really. Quiet about it. The kind of quiet that looks like contentment until it doesn't. Josephine had set down the carpetbag and looked at the room. Small, clean, a window that faced a garden that was mostly bare earth at this time of year, a hook on the back of the door. Sufficient. She had said, "I'll take it." "I know," Dottie had said, and gone back downstairs. By 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, Josephine had emptied the supply room entirely into the corridor, which was an act of commitment she had learned was necessary. You could not reorganize around the things you were reorganizing. You had to take everything out and look at it honestly and decide what was worth keeping and where it ought to live. She had found 3 boxes of plaster bandages, 2 of which were correctly stored, and 1 of which had been placed inexplicably behind a crate of brown glass bottles. She had found a bottle of carbolic acid with a cracked seal that should have been disposed of months ago. She had found a ledger of supply orders dating back 4 years, written in 2 different hands. The earlier entries in a small, controlled script she had come to recognize as Constance's. The later ones in Edmund's looser hand, with increasing gaps between them, and a note in the margin of the last page that read simply, "Ask C," beside an item he had apparently never gotten around to ordering. She looked at that note for a moment. Then she set the ledger aside. She was on her knees sorting a box of surgical thread by gauge when she heard the front door. Edmund Farrow had not come in on a Saturday since Josephine had started. She did not know whether this was habit or guilt or simply the shape of a life that had organized itself around someone else's rhythms and not yet reorganized around their absence. She heard his footsteps in the front room, then the pause, then the footsteps again, moving toward the corridor. He stopped when he saw the corridor. Every shelf from the supply room was now propped against the wall. Every box was open. The floor was covered in an arrangement that looked, to the uninitiated eye, like disorder, but which Josephine had organized into a clear taxonomy. Things to keep and rehouse, things to check for viability, things to discard, things requiring reorder. Edmund looked at it. Then he looked at Josephine, who was still on her knees with a box of surgical thread. "It's Saturday," he said. "Yes?" She held a spool up to the light, checking the thread for degradation. "I didn't ask you to come in on Saturday." "No." She set the spool in the keep pile. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him deciding whether to say something about the corridor, about the Saturday, about any of it. She gave him time, which she had learned was what Edmund Farrow required when something had unsettled him. Not prompting, just time and the absence of expectation. "The boiler at Dottie Crane's," she said, when the silence had lasted long enough, "is broken." "Ah," he said. Something in him settled. He understood practical reasons. Practical reasons were the kind he knew how to receive. He looked at the corridor again. "What are you finding?" "Carbolic acid with a cracked seal. I'll need you to confirm it's not salvageable before I discard it." She gestured to the bottle, which she had placed separately from everything else. 3 months of supply orders that weren't made because someone wrote "Ask C" and then didn't ask C, and then presumably stopped needing to ask because C simply noticed and ordered without being asked. And then C left, and no one noticed she'd stopped. Edmund said nothing. "You're short on plaster bandages," Josephine said. "Not critically, but within a fortnight you will be. And the brown glass bottles need relabeling. 2 of the labels are illegible." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him.
"I'll have a reorder list ready by Monday."
He crouched down, which surprised her. Not because it was unexpected of him exactly, but because most men, in her experience, did not crouch down to look at things at the level of someone who was already on the floor. They stood above and assessed from above, which was a different kind of looking and produced different conclusions. He picked up the supply ledger. He turned to the last page. He read the note in the margin. "Ask C," he said. "Yes." He set the ledger down carefully. He did not say anything for a moment, and Josephine returned to the surgical thread, because there was still work to do, and the work did not pause for realizations, however large. "She was ordering things," he said, "that I didn't know needed ordering." "Yes." "For how long?" Josephine considered the ledger entries, the shift in handwriting, the dates. "At least 2 years where the pattern is clear, possibly longer." Edmund put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor between them. He had the expression of a man conducting a careful internal examination and finding the results professionally interesting in a way that was personally very uncomfortable. "I didn't know," he said. "No," Josephine said. "That was, I think, rather the point." It was a sharper thing to say than she usually permitted herself with him, and she felt him receive it, not with offense, but with the particular stillness of a person who has been told an accurate thing by someone who had no obligation to tell them. "The carbolic acid," he said after a moment. He picked up the bottle, turned it, examined the seal with the same attention he gave to clinical assessments. "Discard it. The crack's too far along." He set it in the discard pile. "I'll order new. I'll add it to the list." He stayed. That was the thing she had not anticipated. He stayed, crouching beside the sorted piles, picking things up and examining them and setting them down, not interfering with her organization, but participating in it in a quiet and useful way. He confirmed what should be kept. He identified 2 items she hadn't recognized and told her what they were for. He carried the discard pile to the bin at the back of the building without being asked. They worked in silence for a long time, which was comfortable in the way that silence is only comfortable between people who have already established that they do not need to fill it. At 11:30, Dottie Crane arrived. She appeared at the front door with a covered pot and the expression of a woman who has decided to do something and is not interested in discussing whether it was a good idea. "Boiler's still broken," she said to Josephine, setting the pot on the waiting room table without ceremony. "Brought soup. You'll have eaten nothing." She looked at Edmund, who had emerged from the corridor with dust on his coat. "Dr. Farrow?" "Mrs. Crane?" "Sit down," she said to both of them, in the tone of a woman who has managed a boarding house for 20 years and is not asking. They sat. Dottie produced bowls from somewhere in the large bag she carried, which Josephine had come to understand contained approximately everything Dottie considered necessary for any situation, and she ladled soup with the efficiency of someone who has fed people in inconvenient circumstances many times before. She sat down herself, which was not something Josephine had expected. "I knew Constance," she said to Edmund without preamble. Not cruelly, but directly, in the way that Dottie did things. Edmund looked at his soup. "Yes." "She told me, the last time she came for tea, that she was very tired." Dottie said it simply. "I didn't ask her to explain. I should have." She paused. "I'm telling you because I think you ought to know that she was tired before she left, not because of leaving. The leaving wasn't what made her tired." Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "No, I don't think it was." Dottie looked at him. Then she looked at Josephine. Then she looked at the corridor, where the supply room's contents were still arranged in their careful taxonomy, waiting to be returned to their proper places. "She was good at this," Dottie said. Not Constance. Josephine understood she meant the work, the building, the practice. "So are you." She said it to Josephine without inflection, as though it were simply observable fact. "Different, but good." "I know," Josephine said. Dottie almost smiled. "I know you know." She stood, collected her bowl, and moved toward the door. "Boiler should be fixed by evening. You can come back for dinner if you want, or stay here if you'd rather." She said it to Josephine alone, which was a particular kind of acknowledgement. Then she looked at Edmund. "The reorder list she's making. You'll pay for it promptly." It was not a question. "Yes," Edmund said. "Good." She took her bag and went out. The supply room was finished by 2 in the afternoon. Everything in its place, labeled, legible, ordered by frequency of use. Josephine stood in the doorway and looked at it the way she always looked at a completed thing. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular stillness of a person who has made something function that was not functioning before, and who knows, without needing to be told, that the work was worth doing. Edmund stood behind her. She could hear him breathing, looking at the same shelves. "There's something I should tell you," he said. Josephine waited. "The ledger note you found, the one in the margin." He paused. "At the end of chapter 6. She turned to look at him. His face was entirely composed in the way she had learned meant the opposite. "I know whose name was in that margin," he said. "And I think you do too." He looked at her steadily. "What I don't know is why Constance wrote it there. And I think, Mrs. Blunt, that you may have already worked that out." The supply room was very quiet. The light through the single small window was the flat white light of a winter Saturday, neither warm nor cold, simply present. Josephine looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said.
I think I have.
And then she told him. The letter took him 11 days to write, not because he did not know what to say. He had known, in the broad strokes, since that Saturday afternoon in the supply room, when Josephine had told him quietly and without embellishment what she believed Constance had meant by the margin note, and he had stood very still and felt something shift in him like a bone resetting, painful and necessary and overdue. He had known since then. The difficulty was not knowledge. The difficulty was the sentences themselves, which kept arriving wrong. Too explanatory, too defensive, too much like a man arguing a case he had already lost. He wrote it on a Sunday, the third Sunday of February, at the desk in his study, with the fire burning low and the house around him in its particular silence. He had grown accustomed to the silence by then. It had taken some weeks. "Constance," he wrote, "I am not writing to ask you to return. I am writing because I have recently learned several things I should have understood years ago, and it seemed important to say so, even if it changes nothing, which I expect it won't. You deserved better than my inattention. I do not mean only the practice. I mean the candlesticks. I mean Tuesday mornings. I mean all of it." He sealed it before he could revise it further. He posted it Monday morning on his way to the office. Harriet Odom came in on the second Thursday of February, as she had come in on the second Thursday of most months for the past 6 years. For the hip that troubled her in cold weather, and the general sociability of the thing which she would never have admitted to, but which Josephine had identified within her first fortnight. "The hip," said Harriet, settling into the chair across from Josephine's desk with the authority of a woman who had earned her chair through consistent patronage, "is somewhat better." "I'm glad to hear it," said Josephine, making a note. "Not entirely better. Still worth a visit." "Of course." "Is he in?" "He's with Mr. Alcott. Mr. Alcott has a persistent cough and opinions about it." Harriet made a sound that conveyed her familiarity with Mr. Alcott's opinions. She settled more comfortably into the chair, arranged her coat, and looked around the waiting room with the proprietary satisfaction of a woman who had watched it improve. The fire was laid properly. The chairs were arranged so that patients who did not wish to speak to one another were not forced into proximity. The table held 3 months' worth of the Illustrated London News, and nothing older, which had not been the case before. "How long?" Harriet asked. 15 minutes, I expect. He's nearly done." "I'll wait." This was not in question. "Lyle is at the smithy. I told him I'd be an hour." "Will he worry?" Harriet considered this with genuine thoughtfulness. "No," she said. "He knows where I am." He always knows where I am. He says I generate more sound than a reasonable person requires, but he's never once had trouble locating me. She paused. He means it kindly. Josephine looked up from the appointment book. "I believe you." "He's a man of very few words," Harriet said. 65 years old, and he has spent perhaps 40 of them married to me, and I think he has found a kind of peace in it. Like a man who builds his house near a river. After a while, the sound of the water isn't noise. It's just where you live. Josephine wrote something in the margin of the appointment book. Not a medical note, just a word or two, a private notation she kept in the margins of things.
and then set her pen down. "That's a generous way to describe it," she said. "It's an accurate way," said Harriet. "Lyle is a generous man, but he's not a sentimental one. He doesn't pretty things up. He just sees them as they are." She looked at Josephine with the direct, assessing gaze that Josephine had learned to recognize as Harriet's version of affection. "He asked about you, you know." "Did he?" "He did. I'd told him about you, about Thursday when you walked in here. He said, 'Is she settled now?' And I said, 'I thought you were getting there.' And he said, 'Good. Some people are built for the work they end up doing. It's a waste when they don't find it.'" Josephine was quiet for a moment. "He said that?" "Word for word, as I told you. He doesn't waste words, so the ones he uses tend to stick." Harriet smoothed her coat over her knees. "I thought you should know." From behind the closed door of the examination room came the sound of Mr. Alcott's voice, raised in what was either distress or emphasis. With Mr. Alcott, the distinction was academic. Josephine glanced at the clock, made a small note, and returned her attention to Harriet. "He's right," she said after a moment. "I am settled." It was true. It had become true gradually, the way most true things did, not in a single moment of clarity, but in the accumulation of ordinary days, each one slightly better organized than the last, each one adding something small to the structure she was building. The billing was now correct. She had recovered £11 in unbilled house calls from the previous quarter. The supply room held what it was supposed to hold, labeled in a hand that was neither Constance's nor Edmund's, but her own. The appointment book ran 3 weeks ahead. She had hired a girl named Meg on Tuesday and Wednesday afternoons to help with the filing. A girl of 16 who was quick and quiet and who had, Josephine suspected, the same capacity for invisible competence that Josephine herself had discovered at 14, and whom she was determined to compensate fairly and thank out loud. She thanked Edmund out loud, too, when he did something worth thanking. It had startled him the first time. He appeared in the doorway of the examination room at 11:20, Mr. Alcott having been managed and dispatched, and he looked, as he increasingly looked these days, like a man who was sleeping adequately and had remembered that he was allowed to. "Harriet," he said, with what Josephine had come to recognize as his genuine warmth, which was different from his professional warmth and considerably less guarded. "Edmund," said Harriet, "the hip." "Come through." He held the door. He had started doing that, small courtesies, the kind that cost nothing but attention, which was the only currency they had ever actually cost him. Josephine had not commented on it. It was not her business to comment on it. But she had noticed, in the way she noticed most things, quietly, accurately, without making more of it than it was. She turned back to the appointment book. The morning moved through its hours. At 12:30, after the last patient had gone and Meg had gone with them, she lived 2 streets over and had a mother who expected her for lunch, Edmund came to stand in the doorway between the examination room and the front office. He did this sometimes, in the quiet between the morning and the afternoon. It had taken Josephine 3 weeks to understand that he was not hovering or supervising, but simply present, in the way that people are sometimes present in rooms they have begun to find comfortable. "I had a reply," he said. Josephine looked up. "From Constance." She waited. "She is in Bristol," he said, "with her sister.
She is, well, he paused, finding the word. She says she is well. She thanks me for the letter.
She says she is glad the practice is in capable hands. He looked at the appointment book on Josephine's desk, at the neat columns and the corrections in red ink, and the small, efficient universe she had built in the space Constance had left. I think she means you. I expect she means the practice, said Josephine. I expect she means both. He was quiet for a moment. She also says that she has taken a position with a solicitor's firm, managing their offices. Josephine felt something settle in her, a weight she had not entirely known she was carrying, the weight of a woman she had never met, whose absence she had been, for 3 months, quietly filling, not replacing, filling, which was different. The space had needed filling. Constance had needed to go. Good, she said. Yes, said Edmund. I thought so too. He stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then he said, Josephine. It was the first time he had used her given name without the Mrs. in front of it. She was not certain he had noticed. She was not certain she minded. Thank you, he said, for Thursday, for walking in. I needed work, she said. It was practical. It was, he agreed. And yet, she looked at him steadily. He looked back. This was something they had learned to do, look at things directly, without the elaborate avoidance that characterized people who were afraid of what they might see. Edmund had been afraid, once, of what he might see. He was less afraid now. Josephine had never particularly been afraid of it. She had simply learned, very young, that clear sight was expensive and worth every penny. And yet, she said. In the afternoon, Lyle Odom came to collect his wife. He was a large man, the blacksmith's build still on him at 65, white-haired and unhurried, with hands that looked as though they had spent a lifetime doing exactly what hands were designed for. He came into the waiting room and took off his hat and nodded to Josephine with the economy of a man who had learned that a nod, properly executed, contained everything a longer greeting required. Mrs. Blunt, he said. Mr. Odom, she's still with the doctor. Another few minutes. He sat down in the chair nearest the fire without being invited to, which was not rudeness, but ease. The ease of a man who was comfortable in most rooms, because he had stopped needing rooms to prove anything to him. He held his hat in his hands and looked at the fire. Josephine went back to her work. After a moment, he said, Harriet tells me you've got this place running properly. It's running well, she said. She says you walked in on a Thursday. I did. And before that? She glanced up. He was looking at her with the same direct, uncomplicated attention that Harriet had described. The man who sees things as they are, without the editorial. I was managing other things, she said, before Thursday. He nodded, as if this were sufficient, which it was. Harriet managed things for years before she had anything official to call it, he said. I used to watch her and think, there's a person who knows what to do with a problem. You can always tell. Some people see a problem and step back. Some people walk toward it. Josephine set her pen down. "I needed work," she said, which was what she always said, because it was true.
"Sure," said Lyle Odom. "And the work needed you. Both things can be true." He said it the way he said everything, without emphasis, without the weight of a man who believes he is delivering wisdom. Just a fact, observed and stated, the way you might note the weather or the time. Josephine looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I suppose they can." The door to the examination room opened, and Harriet emerged with the particular energy of a woman who has been listened to for 40 minutes and is refreshed by it. She saw her husband in the chair and said, "There you are," in a tone that suggested she had known exactly where he was the entire time, which she had. "Here I am," said Lyle, standing. Harriet turned to Josephine. "Same time next month?" "I'll put you in the book," said Josephine, and did. When they had gone, the waiting room was empty and the fire had settled, and the afternoon light came through the window at the low angle of a February that was considering becoming March. Josephine sat at her desk and looked at the appointment book, at the weeks laid out before her in their orderly columns, each slot a small promise of work to be done, and done well. She thought about Constance Farrow in Bristol, managing a solicitor's offices, doing what she had always been able to do in a place that had asked her to do it, and would, Josephine hoped, remember to say so. She thought about Thomas, briefly and without the gutting grief that had characterized the first months. Just a thought, the way you think of a room you used to live in, with recognition and something that was no longer only pain. She thought about Thursday, the cold morning, the unguarded waiting room, the man in the doorway who had looked at her and said, "You're not a patient," as if this were a problem, not yet understanding that it was a solution. She opened the appointment book to the following Thursday and wrote her own name in the margin, the way she had taken to doing, not in any official column, just there in the margin, a small notation. J. Blunt, present. She had been present every Thursday since the first one. She expected she would be present on the Thursdays to come. Some people walk toward things. She had always known which kind she was.